that the United States now is about 14% of the world economy. Economists measure this by the gross domestic product, and we use something called purchasing power parity to adjust the GDPs of different countries of the world to get a scaling. And the US is about 14% of the world economy. China at this point is about 19%. It's a larger economy. Not shocking, because China has more than 4 times the US population. So when the BRICS get together, this means China, India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and a number of other countries not quite so large. We're talking about more than 40% of the world GDP. We're talking about a grouping that is larger than the so-called G7 countries, which are the countries in the US alliance, the US, Canada, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. In other words, the BRICS countries that this year have the presidency with Brazil are larger, significantly larger than the G7 in economic weight. When we talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's a slightly different grouping because it's basically an Asia group, not a global group, but it also includes Russia, China, India, Central Asian countries, Belarus, and when you add
Indonesia, Jeff?
Indonesia, yes, part of the SCO. Yes, I think so. Pardon me for not being absolutely sure. Indonesia, President Prabowo was going to go, ended up going to one of the events in Beijing. So I think that that's right. And Indonesia, by the way, is a huge country, a huge part of the Southeast Asian economy, almost half that population. With the SCO, which is basically this Asian group, this is also more than 40% of the world population, almost half of the world population. And not only is the share of either the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS, where Indonesia certainly is a member, not only are those populous and a substantial fraction of the world output, but they're also the fast growing part of the world economy. They are poorer per person, but being poorer also means that they have more headroom for fast growth. They're catching up, in other words, with the income levels of the United States and Europe. And so they are a large part of the world. They are the fast growing part of the world. They're actually the high saving part of the world also. In other words, of that part of your annual output, what do you put aside for investment in the future? In China, it's more than 40% of the annual output that's put aside. And China sometimes reached more than 50% of its annual output that it put aside in investments in fast rail and long distance power transmission and conversion to electric vehicles and so forth. In the United States, we're barely saving right now, around 15% of our output, but even that is mostly depreciation now. In other words, it's mostly saving just to make up what is wearing out or depreciating each year. So slow growing and low saving part of the world. These other groupings are a fast growing and high saving and investment part of the world. And this is coming as a huge shock to the egos and the psyches of the Western leaders who think this is all perfidious and evil and how can this be? And Donald Trump sits there giving his orders to each of these countries. Brazil, you must change your judicial process. And Russia, of course, you have to stop your war in the next 10 days. And India, we're going to punish you for buying Russian oil. And China, the list is too long even to mention. And they look and say, well, he's not our boss. He's not our emperor. And then they say, no, thank you. And then the United States really gets upset, and Mr. Peter Navarro goes out and says these are despicable vampire economies and adds to the venom. And these places, which are billions of people, are looking on at the United States and saying, that's a rather intemperate way to act. You told us you were a partner. You told us that we were together in this. And so this dynamic that's underway right now, where the U.S. is making demands of more populous, larger economies, and demands that are absolutely weird and arbitrary and hypocritical, one after the other, it's just not playing well. Not at all. It's not strengthening America. It's not getting other countries to bend to our will. It is accelerating their view that, well, the U.S. is an unstable, rude, intemperate, unreliable, untrustworthy place. Maybe we should get together ourselves and have a calmer, more stable relationship among ourselves.
So the timing of those 50% tariffs on India from a Western perspective couldn't have been worse.
Incredible economic growth for 40 years, roughly 10% per year. And in the case of China, that provoked a geopolitical reaction from the United States. The geopolitical reaction was that the U.S. political class came to view China first as a concern, then as a threat, and now, though the term isn't maybe always used, de facto as an enemy. This is, in my opinion, a terrible misconception. It's a kind of paranoia or an attempt by the United States to maintain a hegemony that it doesn't have. I believe the U.S. has delusions of power. I'm talking about the U.S. political class. They don't understand we're in a multipolar world. They want to be in a U.S.-only led world. China is an affront to that. So starting roughly a decade ago, the U.S. turned to quite hostile policies vis-a-vis China. And you mentioned the trade war as one of those instruments, but it goes well beyond the trade war. It goes to military buildup in East Asia, in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan, in other U.S. military bases. It goes to diplomacy, creating anti-China instruments like the Quad or AUKUS. It goes to technology export bans and overt attempts to contain China's growth. And this has been going on for a decade. So finally, put Taiwan back into this story. From inside Taiwan, there is a long-term trend towards wanting independence, a democratic system, a new generation of young people without the emotional or experiential ties to the mainland, unlike their parents and grandparents. And so there's a growing movement towards independence. On the mainland side, there's a growing movement with political and military and financial power to saying, no way, we are now reunifying. Believe it, because China is so strong. And on the United States side, there is, on the one part, angst about China's strength, there is a pretty broad-based attempt to weaken China in any way, and for mischievous, I think dangerous American politicians, they see Taiwan as something to play with in a way against China, in the same way that many in the U.S. saw Ukraine as something to provoke Russia. The U.S. support for Ukraine's NATO membership was mostly about the U.S. and to weaken Russia, not about Ukraine itself, which ended up losing badly in this proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. So Taiwan is now part of a contest between China and the United States. And China says, don't you dare intervene in our internal policy. There is one China. We have said it from the beginning. Footnote, so has the Republic of China in Taipei said it from 1949. There is one China. Don't you, the United States, come into the middle of this. The U.S., by contrast, says, we're there from the beginning. And we have the right and the duty and the determination to protect Taiwan against any kind of military incursion or forced reunification from the mainland. Don't you dare think about using force. And while we have technically a strategic ambiguity as to whether we would militarily support Taiwan, in fact, President Biden said on repeated occasions, yes, we would defend Taiwan. And so this is indeed a very hot situation and a very dangerous situation. Three actors, China, capital in Beijing of the People's Republic of China, that says there is one China and nobody should think differently. And reunification is a historic must. It's going to happen. And if it has to happen by force, that's not ruled out. Taiwan politically is divided into many different groups. Those who say prudently maintain the status quo, those who say we should aim for reunification, those who say we should aim for independence. So the politics in Taiwan is very lively indeed. And the United States is saying we reserve the right to defend Taiwan. We reserve the right to arm Taiwan over PRC objections. We reserve the right to visit Taiwan, to have meetings with politicians. It's very fraught, and it reminds me a lot of Ukraine, and a misstep by any of the actors could lead to a devastating conflict. Relevant, this scene from Paris, because Paris is in a big debt crisis, and the budget is out of control, and the debt has reached 114% of GDP. And in the United States, it's only reached 100% of GDP. And Britain is in a deep crisis. And the German chancellor tells his people, we have to arm militarily and we're going to have to cut our social spending because of that. In other words, the demands are coming from a Western world, if I could call it that is overstretched, that is poorly managed, where the politicians, one after another, starting with Donald Trump with an approval rating of about 38% and a disapproval rating more than 50%, and Macron in France with an approval rating under 20%, actually, with Starmer in the UK with an approval rating, I think, of maybe the low 20s, with Merz in Germany, the chancellor's approval rating plummeting as well. The West is making demands of the rest of the world, but it can't even manage its own society, its own social issues, its own political stability right now. And yet it's so used to bossing the rest of the world around that it continues to do so, even though we have the question, will the U.S. government remain open by the end of the month? But no, Trump is off making his demands. He said yesterday, vis-a-vis India, he told the Europeans, you should put 100% tariffs on India and China because they're importing oil from Russia. So more demands on the rest of the world, which of course all of them completely brushed aside, but which just makes the U.S. even more absurd in the eyes of these other countries. And with instability rising throughout Europe, we should get our house under control. We should end these wars. We should stop the crazy wars of Israel and start attending to some of our real problems right at home.
Absolutely. There are a lot of parallels with Ukraine. Ukraine became, in the American mind, contested territory in a contest with Russia. Who would control Ukraine? It's a strange question. The answer in the case of Ukraine should have been that Ukraine would be left neutral as its original constitution and as its government 15 years ago wanted. But for the U.S., neutrality was not good enough. So the U.S. participated in a coup in 2014 that brought in a pro-NATO government. And there's been a contest that turned into, of course, a devastating war over the future of Ukraine. Taiwan, of course, has many completely different historical roots, but there is a kind of contest underway. And of course, as in the case of Ukraine, it also involves very active Taiwanese politics. Taiwan is a place of complexity in Chinese history, and without the long panorama, it was part of the Qing dynasty until Japan took Taiwan as a colony in 1895 after winning the Sino-Japanese War. And Japan ruled Taiwan as a colony from 1895 to 1945. At that time, when Japan was defeated in World War II, Taiwan returned to China, to what was then the Republic of China, under the rule of Chiang Kai-shek. But a civil war broke out in China soon after that between the communist-led side under Mao Zedong and the nationalist government of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek. And in 1949, the communists won, declared the People's Republic of China with the capital in Beijing, and Chiang Kai-shek evacuated, defeated and evacuated to the island of Taiwan and declared the rule of the Republic of China with the capital in Taipei. And that's the roots of today's complexity. There were, in 1949, two competitors. One had won the mainland. The other had evacuated to the island. Both declared one China. The mainland government declared the People's Republic of China as the ruler of all of China, that is mainland Taiwan and other islands, whereas Taiwan declared the Republic of China, the ruler of one China, mainland and islands. But of course, the Republic of China only controlled Taiwan and surrounding islands, whereas the mainland controlled or the People's Republic of China was the mainland and the vast territory and population of China. But there was on both sides of the Taiwan Straits the idea of one China, just contesting who would rule China. Well, again, the complexities are enormous, but the United States was the ally of the Republic of China in World War II and was fervently anti-communist after World War II. And so when the Civil War ended, the United States continued to recognize the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan and did not recognize the People's Republic of China. Of course, the vast, vast, vast majority of China was in the mainland, and therefore it was governed by the People's Republic of China. The United Nations recognized that fact against U.S. opposition in 1971. And so the seat at the UN for China and in the Security Council that had been held by Taiwan, that is the Republic of China, up until 1971, from the founding of the UN, shifted to the People's Republic of China. Now, Taiwan was no longer represented in the UN, and the mainland, the People's Republic of China, said that diplomatic relations with the PRC of any other country, by any other country, meant that that country would subscribe to the one China policy, that there was only one Chinese government, that it represented all of China, and that that government was the People's Republic of China with the capital in Beijing. So all over the world, almost all countries with what was then some dozens, but now very, very few, recognized the People's Republic of China. The United States shifted its recognition in that way in 1979, ending its recognition of the Republic of China at Taiwan and diplomatically recognizing the People's Republic of China. And that also initiated an era of close economic relations between what was then a quite poor mainland and the United States. And the mainland became the producer of a lot of basic industrial goods and inputs and assembly operations for the U.S. economy. And on that basis, the People's Republic of China experienced remarkable economic growth. One could say justifiably, I think, the greatest economic reform period in world history, perhaps from 1980 to now, becoming a extremely sophisticated, modern, technologically cutting-edge economy that in absolute size, according to purchasing power parity, is bigger than the U.S. economy now. Well, all of this meant that for some decades, Taiwan was on the margins, but when the U.S. shifted its diplomatic recognition, it also passed U.S. legislation saying that it would continue to support Taiwan's status in rejecting any forcible reunification of the island with the mainland. Whereas the mainland said, of course, Taiwan is part of one China. And actually, Taiwan said, yes, Taiwan is part of one China under the Republic of China Constitution, which still prevails. The idea of Taiwan and the United States was that Taiwan would have a path of autonomy, let's say, de facto independent, not in a political sovereign sense, but in a daily behavioral sense of politics and economics and governance, and that the United States would protect Taiwan against any forcible reunification attempted by the mainland. That's more or less a description of the status quo now. But things have gotten much more complicated, if I may say. And the reason is that both Taiwan and the mainland became extraordinarily successful economically. And that has led to massive political and geopolitical changes as well. In the case of Taiwan, this great boom started actually before the mainland's boom. So Taiwan's boom started in the 1960s, and Taiwan became one of the Asian tiger economies. It grew very rapidly. And then starting in the 1990s, it actually became home to the most advanced semiconductor chip fabrication in the world with TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. And this company produces about 90% or more of the most advanced chips in the whole world. So Taiwan achieved a spectacular economic success. And in that context, Chiang Kai-shek, the original ruler, died in 1975. Soon after, his son became the second ruler of what was then an authoritarian government. But starting in the 1980s, it began to liberalize and to democratize. And in the 1990s, went to an electoral democratic system. And in 1996, elected its first freely elected democratic president. So the political path of Taiwan became a democracy. At the same time, starting roughly 15 years after Taiwan's takeoff, maybe 20, but roughly 15 years, China began its rapid ascent. And China experienced this incredible economic growth for 40 years, roughly 10% per year. And in the case of China, that provoked a geopolitical reaction from the United States. The geopolitical reaction was that the U.S. political class came to view China first as a concern, then as a threat, and now, though the term isn't maybe always used, de facto as an enemy. This is, in my opinion, a terrible misconception. It's a kind of paranoia or an attempt by the United States to maintain a hegemony that it doesn't have. I believe the U.S. has delusions of power. I'm talking about the U.S. political class. They don't understand we're in a multipolar world. They want to be in a U.S.-only led world. China is an affront to that. So starting roughly a decade ago, the U.S. turned to quite hostile policies vis-a-vis China. And you mentioned the trade war as one of those instruments, but it goes well beyond the trade war. It goes to military buildup in East Asia, in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan, in other U.S. military that are important. First, in the mainland view, the outside world is out to weaken or destroy or divide China. This is not wrong, and it's also part of the historical experience. It's not strictly right in that this may refer to some intemperate politicians in the United States mainly, but they're there. That's real. So China has its so-called century of humiliation in which outside powers divided, weakened, and in many ways devastated China, starting with the British, as is usually true, in 1839 in the First Opium War. Then there was the French and British in the Second Opium War at mid-century. There was a great civil war in China that emerged from that, the Taiping Rebellion, as it's called by Western historians. But that was perhaps the largest civil war in world history, with tens of millions of deaths. Then there was the incursions at the end of the century, the most dire of which was the Japanese invasion of China in 1894-95, in which both Taiwan was lost and Korea was on the first step to becoming a colony, which happened in 1910. Then, of course, Japan invaded China in 1931 and devastated China in war until 1945, with tens of millions of people, or estimated between 10 and 20 million people dead in World War II as a result of the Japanese war. So from the Chinese perspective, never again will China be divided from the outside. And so there's a particular neuralgia about Taiwan. Oh, look, they're at it again. They're out to weaken us. They're out to divide us. This was a complete devastation. From the U.S. side, the U.S. Has been a foe of communist China because the U.S. has this deep anti-communism in its mentality, even when the term is in the Chinese characteristic, so-called. This is a super sophisticated mixed economy, private capital galore, mixed economy, a public sector as well. But in the U.S. mentality, communism has been the evil for a century since the Bolshevik Revolution. And in the case of China, already with the founding of the People's Republic of China, the U.S. backed Taiwan in this war against communism. And then in 1951, John Foster Dulles, who would go on to become the fervent anti-communist foreign minister, Secretary of State of the United States under Dwight Eisenhower, identified the so-called First Island Chain, which is a chain, an archipelago that the United States would defend, including Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, Guam. And this idea was, if the U.S. controls this chain, it limits China's access, including submarine access and naval access more generally, to the wider Pacific Ocean. It hems China in. It threatens China's sea routes. It makes possible chokeholds over China's food supplies coming from abroad and its energy resources coming from abroad. That First Island Chain became part of U.S. military doctrine. China understands that. This is, again, part of this right now, almost a Cold War, or maybe a Cold War between the U.S. and China. And so this is another reason why there's this depth, not only maybe I left an impression of symbolism of American power or desire to weaken China, but military doctrine and strategic doctrine, and on the Chinese side, a deep awareness of history and a determination not again to be subjected to the Western powers which did such devastation, or Japan, which, as it itself said at the end of the 19th century, joined the Western imperial club.
I think this history and ideology is very important because when you end up in a strategic situation where winner takes all and neither side is willing to give an inch, you usually wandering into very dangerous territory. And when it involves the two greatest power in the international system, we do have a problem. But Professor Sachs, thank you so much, as always, for your time. I know you're a very busy man, so I want to add more of your time.
Just to say, we need, above all, prudence and peace here. Because if it were not for the U.S. meddling, I'm quite sure that across the straits, there would be a solution to these issues that is peaceful, sensible, and especially pragmatic. And if the world, and God help us, politicians in the United States, are pragmatic and prudent, then peace will prevail. If they are delusional, as they were in Ukraine, hot-headed, arrogant, reckless, provocative, then Taiwan could become a flashpoint, and a very dangerous one.
That's a great warning. So thanks again.
Great to be with you. Bye. Thanks. See you soon. Bye-bye.
and U.S. supported attack on Doha. Well, it's as troubling as it sounds.
Illegal, reckless, profoundly destabilizing. Again, this is just like the attack on Iran a few weeks ago, where the attack was to kill the negotiators of ongoing negotiations. Honestly, Israel can yell Hamas all it wants. Who they tried to kill yesterday were the people negotiating the ceasefire. Israel doesn't want a ceasefire. It wants to kill as many Palestinians as it can, or ethnically cleanse them, or crush them one way or another. It doesn't want a ceasefire. That's why they bombed Doha, tried to kill the negotiators, and ordered their troops into Gaza City all on the same day, with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians clinging to their lives right now facing another onslaught. This is a murder machine. This is not a state of law. And by the way, Trump said he didn't even know about it for something that's been prepared, obviously, for many, many weeks. And it's quite possible he doesn't know about it, because it's quite possible that he's basically the figurehead, and that the Mossad and the CIA certainly knew about it. But maybe they didn't happen to mention it to the president until the last.
And yes, in our system, this is absolutely possible. That's why I've referred to Israel's dominance over Washington as a form of blackmail. It really feels like that.
The use of blackmail has been a standard part of American politics for a long time. We don't know most of it, but we certainly know enough that Epstein, for example, was a Mossad agent and engaged in gathering compromising materials, let us say, of the American political class. And that's why the files suddenly weren't there. That's why Donald Trump's signature isn't his signature. Come on. This is so sad and so pathetic.
Why?
But here's the question. Why were Doha's radar and air defenses offline when the Israelis struck, especially considering those systems are operated by the enormous U.S. military base sitting right outside Doha?
Yes to know. It's possible. I don't doubt it. But the United States government surely knew. Israel was not flying all that way without the U.S. security apparatus absolutely knowing what was happening, period. With permission, because he knows that the permission will be granted. So there's nothing to ask. It's always granted by the U.S. He can give deniability to Donald Trump, or he doesn't even have to ask. So no, but Mossad and the CIA coordinate. That's for sure.
Well, we also know that Royal Air Force jets refueled the Israeli aircraft mid-air. And if the RAF was involved, then MI6 was involved. If MI6 was involved, the CIA was involved. It really doesn't take much to connect those dots.
Most important point. We are not run as a democracy. Donald Trump may be in no more position to do much about this than we are. This is Mossad, which is a global killing machine. And by the way, all the Israeli politicians came out immediately after this and said, we will go anywhere. Our long arm reaches anywhere. Yeah, they feel absolutely the impunity to murder people anywhere and to bomb people anywhere. And that's why Israel is engaged in wars everywhere right now.
And here's the thing. They could actually shut down that American base, the biggest one in the Middle East. They could just say, pack up, go home.
They won't do that either. It's so sad how we're trapped in this unbelievably bizarre, opaque, Israel-led debacle after debacle. everyone remains a bit supine in this, even Donald Trump, who was disappointed and found out at the last moment and made the call, by the way, supposedly to warn the Qatar side as the bombs were actually dropping. Talk about a figurehead. That's a figurehead. He didn't express displeasure. How could we not have known from our ally? Of course they knew, but maybe he should figure out why he wasn't told.
Now, let me pose another question. Could Marco Rubio realistically serve as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor at the same time? Not legally, of course, but practically. The National Security Advisor has an office right outside the Oval Office, backed by a massive staff analyzing intelligence, military, and economic information, all of it reported straight to the president. Does Trump still have access to that level of infrastructure?
Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, because I don't see any signs of any competence. So I don't know whether he's up to any of these or either of these jobs, much less both of them. We have the biggest amateur hour imaginable. By the way, when the professionals run things, it's often not better. Because our professional CIA class has led the U.S. from one disaster to another. But what we have is the disasters continuing, but absolute amateur hour. So it's all improv, which we just saw in Donald Trump's own remarks. It's complete improv. Hamas was supposed to be considering a ceasefire proposal. Instead, let's kill them. That's a little improv, if that's what passes for U.S. foreign policy.
And finally, who would negotiate with the Israelis again after this, and who would ever trust America to lure them into negotiations again?
So the governments of the Gulf region should absolutely end the diplomatic relations with Israel, end the Abraham Accords, and not only because of yesterday's attack, but because of an ongoing genocide in Palestine. Of course, they should understand that Israel could not do any of this without the United States. And that is a big problem for them because they almost are trapped with U.S. military bases all over the Middle East region. But the fact of the matter is the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the SCO and the BRICS and the African Union and the UN General Assembly all have to say to the United States, this is absolutely untenable. It's illegal. It is in war crimes. It is in gross violation of the will of the world. It happens, by the way, they might mention it, that is gross violation of the will of the American people. And it is leading the world to disaster. Israel is, yes, his Gulf region is at risk because Israel is at war all over the region using F-35s. By the way, U.S. provided military equipment and support. This is a partnership of Mossad and the CIA. They let the president in once in a while, I suppose, on all of this. But this is a partnership that is absolutely reckless and dangerous for the whole world. And I would have thought that a genocide would have been enough to alert this. Deliberately starving 2 million people, I would have thought would have been enough to alert this. But it seems that the tolerance for roguery is almost unimaginably large. But yes, the time has come, as the Prime Minister rightly said, to stop this. The way to stop this is to create a state of Palestine and to put Israel back in its borders, not in this lawless murderous regime which thinks it can go anywhere and murder people anywhere that it wants. It has to stop and live like the rest of humanity is supposed to live according to standards of human behavior and international law. And this can be done, but the United States is the only protection and shield of Israel. So if Donald Trump or the CIA head or whoever's really in charge